So I'd like to begin with a prayer. I invite you to bow your heads. Lord, many of us are gathered here tonight because we have a love for your church and what it can accomplish. Many of us have been touched with how its ideas and life can make such a difference. You know very well, Lord, that we have different ideas about how that church can best serve others as a natural organization. We have different hopes and disappointments, different ways in which we've felt called to serve. Bless the conversation tonight, Lord. May it serve us and the cause of your church. Amen. The background for tonight's meeting is, well, it first started with Pastor's Council meeting last month. One of the members of Pastor's Council said, "So Eric, what is going to be Brenathan Church's response to the bishop's statement?" This was a week before it came out. And I went, Well, part of it is trying to provide an opportunity for conversation. So I had initially talked to Bishop Keith about the idea of having him come an evening like tonight. And he mentioned that there had been quite a bit of discussion in the General Church Board, and Jennifer Prenesti, who's one of the members of the General Church Board, was very interested in not only this meeting, but what we're hoping to have is a follow-up meeting in the new year to talk about women's roles within the Brenathan congregation. She suggested if we were going to do planning that maybe we should try and invite some representatives from the Women in the Ministry group to be part of the planning. And so in addition to Eric Buss and myself and Jennifer Prenesti, we had Tira Keel and Jessica Baker for the plans. And we talked about what we were going to do. And so the planning for tonight that we came up with was the idea of starting off with 15 minutes or so where you people all have brought ideas and thoughts that are important to you, and there's going to be a lot of listening tonight, but we thought it would be good to start off with inviting you to talk to 2, 3, 4 people around you about what thoughts did you bring tonight. Then we have the 29 questions that were submitted, and Bishop Keith and Bishop Buss are going to take turns responding to them. I thought it would be useful then to go back to saying, okay, you've just heard quite a bit. Why don't you find some people around you to talk about what it is that you heard or how you responded. And then we were going to have the final 30 minutes be an open mic time. And I could picture that there could be further questions being asked during that open mic time, but partially because we've already will have heard from the bishops for quite a bit of time. Any questions that are asked, I wouldn't be expecting them to be answered because, you know, in 30 minutes, the suggestion came from our conversation of encouraging the people who speak during the open mic time to keep their comments down to 2 minutes, with the idea of hopefully 50 people can speak. And we could go on beyond 9:30 if that's the wish of people. So to have a picture of what we're expecting for tonight's meeting, one of the thoughts I have is, I was in a conversation where somebody said, what outcome do you expect from this meeting? I'm not gathering this meeting with the thought that people's fundamental opinions on this issue are going to be dramatically changed or specifically changed by this event. I thought it was important, though, that some of the questions that people had in response to the bishop's statement be able to be publicly stated and to hear something of the response, not that you're necessarily going to agree with it, but something of the response and then that open mic time for people to make just further specific comments of their point of view. So I'm hoping that through this conversation, through this interchange, there will be better understanding and not necessarily more agreement, but appreciation of different points of view that exist on this question that's so important to so many of us. So, why don't you spend a little bit of time, if you're willing, talking to some people around you about what thoughts do you bring tonight? What thoughts do you bring tonight? So I'll give you maybe 9 minutes, 10 minutes, since I've already squandered some time. Lots of thoughts that people brought to this evening. So I said we had asked for questions. A large group of questions were sent in by people who've organized it from that Women in the Ministry group. I've done a little bit of organizing of them, a little bit of editing to try and fit them into PowerPoint slides. I checked with Solomon Keel on the editing. I ran the edits by Jessica Baker, and I hope they continue to represent the questions as they were intended. So, to get started, the first question that was posed, or the first set of questions deal with process. We're going to just have to see how far we can get. We're sort of thinking maybe spending about a third of the time on process, a third of the time on doctrine, and a third of the time on organizational issues, but not tight and fast. So we may get to a point that we've already used up a chunk of the time, and we may ask you, okay, out of the 3 questions left, which one do you most want to hear? But right now we can just get started with the first questions.
Yeah, thanks very much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here, to be able to convey some more information and to hear more, because it is an interactive thing. We have basically 29 questions. That's about 2 minutes per question, so we'll try to be fairly brief in our responses. And Pete will be and I will be tag teaming it, so we'll be jumping up and down here. Going with the first question, a concern as to whether those that wrote to me satisfactorily represented the clergy. I'm very confident that it does, frankly. I attended regional meetings in Africa and Asia in the past year, and this topic was considered, and that's where we weren't getting responses from. If I had responses from them, it would have been at least that percentage and probably stronger for a male-only clergy. And it wasn't exactly a poll to take account to determine it. It really was for me to try to figure out if I was assessing the state of the clergy and their general understanding. So I'm pretty confident that it does accurately represent basically what's out there with the clergy. Pete?
Well, let me add my voice of welcome and thanks for showing up tonight. And I hope that the words that we are able to deliver are really informative and helpful. We're up here on the podium, but I hope that maybe this will inspire some one-on-one conversations with some of you. I welcome that. So the question that I was asked here to speak to is just about the paper, one of the papers that was written in support of women's or gender-inclusive clergy by Solomon Keel, and Solomon's here tonight. And I would just say that Solomon rose to the call that Bishop Keith had put forward to say, hey, let's go through a process as a clergy and study the teachings anew, and anybody who has new research, bring it forward. And he did rise to the call with what most people know is a very thorough and lengthy paper that has a lot of information in it. And it's a laudable effort, and I think where this question comes from is that it got to us clergy fairly close to the meetings, and being it so long, did we have enough time to give it due consideration? So I'd say that clergy would say that they gave it as much consideration as the other papers, if not a little bit more. Speaking for myself, I certainly learned some things from his paper and value a lot of that research and encourage you to read it if you have a chance. The paper did raise some doubts and some concerns about the teachings that have been used to support our current stance. And what we do as a clergy then is weigh those against what other ideas are there and to see if they're more weighty or less weighty or how we see them. And where we disagree, we say so. So there are some doctrinal points upon which Solomon received some feedback from his colleagues. That is something that will be continuing in the conversation, I'm sure, but as of yet, it didn't significantly sway colleagues who've seen things differently. Oh, it's me.
Oh, that's, yes, you are.
Sorry about that. We'll get it. So number 3, this is about a concern between the disparity that may exist between the majority clergy view and the majority laity view. And there may be a disparity of that nature. And Brian and I think probably many people would expect this, we're hearing a variety of responses. And it appears to be a greater issue in some parts of the church, less so in others. Are we concerned about disparity? Well, of course we are. To any extent that we see a polarizing issue that brings hurt feelings and some people stepping back, that's not something that we want. It's something that we certainly wrestle with. I don't want to say that we know that the majority of the laity differ with the majority of the clergy on this. We could think about in North America, across the whole church, with people who are active in the church versus people who are connected with it. We don't really know that. But if we were able to determine such a disparity of views between the clergy and the laity, it might not surprise us in that it is the clergy's job to study the Word in depth and maybe to see some things in a slightly different way than people who don't study the Word every day. But we'll just hold that lightly because we don't really know what the disparity is. And in terms of a plan, if it was there, and certainly this is a hope that I would put forward, is that we do spend time listening to each other, learning from each other, that you would speak to clergy members that you know and that clergy members would listen, because I do believe there's more room for understanding in any of this. And also that the hope extends to that we work well together on moving forward from here.
I was just going to add that one of the phenomena of the Council of the Clergy is that papers are presented and we tend to have them digest and settle for a while. So often the effects will be felt several years later after they were given. So it's not a one-and-done process. My question is, why wasn't the laity asked? Well, we did do a fair amount of talking to laity. Many pastors did in their congregations. We heard from an awful lot of people across the spectrum, both those that like the current policy, those that would like a change, those that are somewhere in between. We tried to include as much counsel formally with the clergy as possible. We encouraged them to look at the Facebook page. We actually summarized most of the key ideas that seem to be presented on the Facebook page that seem to be primarily advocating for women to be ordained. There are various forums that went on. So an awful lot of counsel did take place. And did the ministers hear? Well, they heard an awful lot, and that's an important consideration as they look at the doctrines, but their primacy is looking at the doctrines and then seeing what they think right from that and trying to accommodate based on that. So, Pete?
All right, I'll speak to the next 2 questions. Number 5, this is one about, so what do you say to a person who you might be acquainted with who has really strong feelings about this? Outrage is the word that's used there. And I believe I've heard this in the context of a young person responding to peers. So I acknowledge that that's a very tough position to be in that often places someone in a defensive position. And I'll acknowledge also that I've heard people say that they're embarrassed about this particular stance and that they're confused and don't really know how to respond. And I'm not sure that it's my place to say, well, here's how you respond to that. There's no perfect words for everything or a correct formula. But I would share 3 thoughts that I try to keep in mind when I'm in that situation with the hopes that they're helpful. First of all, that this policy is not really designed to be about gender respect. It's something we all care about. It is about something that we're trying to do, which is an authentic attempt to listen to the teachings of the Word. And I know we can disagree on that, but that's where this is coming from. Second thing I try to offer is that this church that we have, this general church, is doing a lot of good for a lot of people in spite of, in some ways, this particular policy around ordination. And it's good to just look for that goodness that's there. And I try to keep in mind the third thing, that people are free to disagree, and that if I have a respect and right for other people to see things and stack things differently than I do, then maybe they would have that respect and right that I have to see things the way I see it without any one of us being negatively motivated. Number 6 there is that there's actually 3 questions in here that I see, so I'll be very brief with these, each part of them, but one of them is this: do not trust in councils, and the council of the clergy got together and an outcome happened. So what's with that? And I would say that the clergy is very, very cautious, as we all should be, about making decisions as a council that binds the church. Our constant effort should be, and always is, to lead back to the Word. And I would say that this very process is doing that for a lot of people. Clergy and lay is leading them back to the Word, which is where the conversation belongs. There's a little bit about the never stated prohibition in the Word. So why are we making this stance with that seeming fact? And we received strong feedback from Brian's letter about that particular part that deals with our interpretation, since there is no clear smoking gun passage or something like that. And it's not that the Word doesn't speak to this issue. It's really how the Word addresses it, or any other issue. The Word gives us principles to work from, and it requires us to weigh the preponderance of evidence. And to many ministers who've studied this, the Word does speak fairly loudly on this issue in terms of those principles. And I know that we're in the realm of interpretation, and things can be interpreted differently. And the final part of this particular question deals with this concept of unanimity. I would smile and just sort of say, I'm not sure that our church has ever had unanimity on anything. And that's because we have a culture of personal approach to the Word and a freedom to disagree with a majority view. The clergy review was designed to get a sense of where other people's minds are on this topic, and we would expect variety from the clergy when they all go to that same place to look at those same teachings. And yet, there was some thematic sameness amongst the clergy's responses that was maybe surprisingly similar than some might have thought. So,
next question about, is there any doubt? Good question. Of course there's doubt. How could there not be doubt in any application of doctrine in any area whatsoever? That's sort of the nature of it. And I'll give an example that I gave a paper to the clergy. It was published in the Life on Can You Know If You're Going to Heaven? There was a whole set of passages that seem to state pretty strongly that you can't know. There are other passages that seem to say, well, you can know. And I think I found some bridge passages in between that sort of suggest when it can be known. And so I presented that, and the basic conclusion was there are times and conditions when it is possible to know what your ruling love is. Several ministers have disagreed with that. And how certain I am of that conclusion? 80, 85%. But that's sort of the nature of the beast. I recall in my early days in the Council of the Clergy, Ormond Odener stood up and was going to give a paper, and he said, "This is the 3rd time I've addressed this council on the subject of the Lord's foresight. And yes, I've changed my mind again." There is the freedom to continually go back, to continually rethink, and that's part of the process. And yet, even though that process is ongoing, we, in many areas, have to come up with some application. And so we give it our best understanding at the time, knowing that it's not perfect, knowing that there'd be disagreements, knowing there are other possible applications, and try to put forth the best we can do at the time. Question as to when we'll revisit this topic. I have no sense of what the future might hold. The council is free to consider it at any time they want. We would hope that if some minister has additional insights from wherever, that they'd be shared with the council, and the council could then consider it. We have just gone through a very extensive process. This was one of the first things I did when I assumed the position, was told the council we really do need to talk about this seriously. And so it was discussed in most of the regional meetings the year before, and then we spent a tremendous amount of time on it in the set of meetings that we just held last June. So are we going to go through a full review like that in the very near future? I suspect that's not likely to happen. I think there's a sense that we need to be dealing with some other things in this church and other things that ministers need in their professional development to become better pastors and teachers. So I wouldn't envision it happening in the near future, whatever that means, but there's nothing to preclude it from happening at any time in the future. So assuming that the topic is not going to suddenly go away, I suspect it will be before the council again at some point in time.
I believe we're transitioning now to the doctrinal understanding questions. So this is sort of section 2 of the questions if you're following along. So this one, question number 9, if you take a chance to just read it, it has a lot of pain underneath it, and I just want to acknowledge that there's a hurt out there on this topic, and probably from some of the people in this room, and a real sense that, is that really what we want? It's not what we want. Is it really the thing to do, given that there are some other perceived challenges with a gender-inclusive clergy? So I would say that I'm very concerned about those kinds of things, and I really try to be open to talking to anybody who has those pains and really try to see where we're coming from. And the truth is that people are free to respond as they will, and some people will step back, and when they do, we grieve. So when we are able to have a dialogue, and I've been privileged to have some of those dialogues with people in the preceding few weeks, I think some of the worst fears or concerns or, real raw feelings can be allayed. And those come in the form of, does the word teach that men are somehow better than women? No, it doesn't. Nobody in the clergy, I believe, ever has said anything of that nature or believes it. Do girls have less spiritual acumen than boys? No, even though that their teachings give us some indication that their minds were created to work differently, and we get to embrace that and honor it. Do we all care about sending the message of gender respect? I sure hope so. And can we be courageous about an effort to learn further what unintended messages are being sent that could cause regrettable hurt? I hope so. I hope we can have that courageous look. And these things, I pray, will help that reinforce the message that we care about many of the same things, despite appearances to the contrary. Number 10. This is a question about some of the leading teachings and sort of the balance sheet. And there's a similarity that I saw between number 10 and number 19. So I'm going to focus here a little bit on the balance sheet or the leading teachings and save some of the fears or the potential negative effects part of this question for a later section. So the letter that Brian sent out had a short list of some of the leading themes, and many teachings were referenced in the whole context of this discussion, and there's no time now to go through all of them. But if you read them, you'll see things about the priesthood's essential function to teach and lead from doctrine that plays in there, the beautiful and pervasive differences that we have between men and women, the calling of men that seems to be there to step forward in the leadership roles in the exploration and presentation of truth, and some of the deeply informative teachings that we have that all of us could reflect on for a long time of why the Lord chose to appear in a male form when he's revealing himself. And how does that sort of balance itself out with all of us being created in the image of God? And of course, in the discussion, in the balance sheet, if you will, there's counter arguments to all of those teachings, and I just want to acknowledge that. But then all of us take as a whole the teachings that were given, and for many of the clergy, they see the totality, the balance sheet, if you will, leading to a male priesthood. And I would add to that that if that person, a minister, sees from that preponderance of teaching that this is the best way to cooperate with the Lord, then I believe that minister is conscience-bound to lead from that perspective. And that might be even if he personally has leanings of it in a different direction or a cultural perspective and inclusiveness that speaks to him personally. And also on this balance sheet, I believe that there's lots of things that were weighed by the clergy, including the abilities that all of us have, men and women, to learn from and speak from the Word. And certainly in there is the specific gifts that the Lord's given to women and how to bring them to new life in the church.
This question really has to do with whether if you have a minister who's not performing as well as he might, wouldn't it be better to have somebody in there who could, even if they were female? And so coming at it sort of from looking at experience. And I'd say a couple of things about this. One is that we try to come more from principle rather than from practicality or expediency in a situation like this. So that we don't look at it so much as, can someone do a job better, but who should be doing that job? Bruce Glenn, in an article a number of years ago in New Church Life, posed the question that if he had a choice between hiring a mediocre new church teacher in a school or a superior teacher who was not of the new church at all and didn't have any interest, who should he hire? We said it would be an easy answer, the mediocre new church teacher. Because even though as an instructor he's not that good or not great, he still brings something to the table that someone not from the church can't possibly bring. And I think that's sort of the attitude there, trying to come off what the writings say in terms of what males have, whether it's perfectly or imperfectly realized in any individual. So I think that's where we're really looking at that. Next was a concern about was some of the doctrinal basis for this coming from books that some do not think are divinely inspired. Well, that might be referring to the famous, the infamous diary passage that there's been so much discussion about. I think if you look at the studies that have been done, many of which have been published in the Life, and I believe almost all of them are on the web page, the blog that Brian Smith has that I referenced in the article, you'll see that the preponderance of the teachings come from the arcana, from conjugal love, from heaven and hell. And yes, there are some references to Apocalypse Explained and spiritual experiences, spiritual diary, but they're really very, very few in number. And I don't believe anyone thinks that they're basing their understanding on just one or two numbers, and certainly not that the leading numbers are coming from an unpublished work. It's interesting, this issue of whether Swedenborg himself published it or not is a relatively new one in the general church. If you look throughout our history, there's been virtually no discussion of this in New Church Life. You see it pop up once in a while, but most of the discussion, especially in the early 20th century, was about whether the canon of the new church ought to be expanded to include the word explained, the philosophic works, the anatomical works of Swedenborg. That's where the discussion was. And I would say that there are a few ministers who try to make a distinction in terms of published, unpublished, but they're not very many. And I would also say that all ministers are aware of it, aware of the context in which any passage is found. So, for example, no one would really take a passage from spiritual experience that's sort of an orphan and say, aha, that's the leading doctrine. But by the same token, you don't read what's in TCR in the same way you read a passage from the Arcana, written at very different times for different audiences. So you do have to appreciate the context in which a passage exists, and also then to look at the totality, not just one or two passages. Try to get a general sense of all of them together. Pete?
Number 13, I like this question. This has a lot of things that I can resonate with in it, and I just would say that I'm personally open to the things mentioned here without necessitating ordination. So the talks about this list of women's special gifts, love and empathy, the ability to help and comfort, a focus on marriage. And what a wonderful set of teachings that we have that we should be exploring and looking to honor in increasing ways. And I'm personally even open to training in the teachings that could bear on these and other uses or even professions that are out there without necessarily having to influence the ordination process in the general church. This question also sort of speaks to an overreach, if you will, of the role of a pastor in the general church, that there's an expansion of expectation on pastors beyond what the word describes as the use of the priesthood. And I think that there's actually some validity to that in some cases where there's certain things that us pastors are called upon to do that really could be the domain of anybody in the church. And this question seems to infer that there are some of those in terms of visiting and counseling and some of those kinds of things. And I would just say that I would agree with that. The second paragraph is interesting. It's not really a question. It's just sort of some statements about this person's perspective as I perceive it. And I want to honor that sentiment. There's a call in there for saying that we need each other. We need male voices and female voices within the church. And I think that that's true. I would love to stand behind that, even if it might lead to a slightly different way we do that than the person who is writing here. And I would say, can we look for ways for men and women to bring forward their talents within the church, within their families, within the professions and homes that they might live in or the communities that they dwell in? And hopefully, if we do that exploration of how to bring the gifts and talents of men and women forward, we will be using the teachings that we have at every step. There's just also a message at the very end there about the clergy meetings and the deliberations that happened there with a bunch of men. And I just want to honor that that's a challenge that happens because it is just a bunch of men in that room. My experience, though, is that most of the pastors who come from various congregations bring with them the perspectives and the values of the people that they serve. And that weighs very heavily into the conversations that we have because they're going to go back with the dialogue, back to preaching, back to working with people. And that's one way that we can say that that is addressed in our current context.